The hour before dawn carries its own particular stillness in the farmlands that press against the edges of the Sahyadri foothills, a quiet so complete it can make a man feel as though the world has been briefly paused, held between one breath and the next. It was in that suspended hour, when the sky above the sugarcane fields had only just begun to lighten from black to the deep bruised blue of pre-morning, that Rajan first heard it. He had been awake long before the sound reached him. A farmer's body learns to rise before it is asked, pulled upright by some wordless internal discipline that has nothing to do with clocks. He had already pulled on his worn cotton shirt, already wound his old shawl around his shoulders against the October cold, already stepped out onto the packed earth of his threshold, to look at the field he had tended for 19 years. The sugar cane stood in dense rustling columns, taller than a man, their tops moving faintly in the pre-dawn wind. He had been watching the field the way farmers watch fields, not for any particular thing, but for everything at once when the sound rose from the tall grass at the far boundary where his land met the tree line. It was low, guttural, not a cry, not quite a growl. Something in between, something that carries even across distance in a way that human sounds rarely do. Rajan stood very still on his threshold. His hand, which had been lifting his chai cup, stopped midway. He knew the forests gave out animals sometimes. Boar came down at the margins, and once a sloth bear had torn apart 2 rows of his young crop 3 seasons back. The sound was not a boar. The sound was not a bear. He set down his chai cup slowly, without a sound, and he waited. It did not come again. He could have gone back inside. Any reasonable person, in the dark, at that hour, with that particular hollow feeling that comes from hearing a sound, one cannot identify any reasonable person would have gone back inside and waited for full light. Rajan stood on the threshold for nearly 2 full minutes, watching the far edge of the field where the grass grew tallest before the trees. Then he unhooked the lantern from the post beside his door and began walking toward it. The field was longer than it looked at night. The cane pressed close on both sides of the narrow path his boots had worn through it over years of walking, and the lantern's small flame made the shadows shift and lean in ways that required effort not to flinch from. He walked slowly, not from fear alone, but from something else, the particular instinct that belongs to men who have spent their lives paying attention to living things, to seasons and soil and the moods of weather. He kept his steps soft. He kept his breathing even. He smelled her before he saw her. A wild, deep musk, warm and animal and unmistakable, settled over him at the last turn in the path before the grass opened out to the tree margin. His lantern caught the broken stems first, a wide area of cane and grass pressed flat and bent, as though something large had lowered itself here with great effort or had been lowered against its will. Then the light moved across the shape of her, and Rajan stopped. She was lying on her side in the flattened grass, half concealed by the cane. Her coat, that amber and black and white coat that the forest wears as one of its most precise and dangerous ornaments, was streaked with damp, her flanks heaving in long, labored intervals. She was large, larger than Rajan had ever seen a leopard from this kind of closeness, and at first the lantern's trembling light made it difficult to understand what he was seeing. Then she shifted slightly, and the swollen weight of her belly became clear against the dark ground, and Rajan understood. She was pregnant, deeply, heavily, imminently pregnant, the kind of full that speaks of hours rather than days, and she was in distress. Her breathing was not right. Even from the distance he held, even in the poor light, the intervals were too long, too effortful, her ribs lifting and falling with a labor that was not the labor of giving birth but something else, exhaustion, perhaps, or pain, from a source he could not see. Her eyes were half open. They caught the lantern light and held it for a moment, that flat and ancient reflective gold of a predator's gaze. She looked at him. She did not move. What Rajan did in the next few moments was not born of bravery in any ordinary sense of that word. He did not feel brave. His heart was striking hard inside his chest, and his hands were not steady, and some very old part of him understood with absolute clarity that the animal in front of him could end him before he had taken 2 steps. But what held him there, and what slowly, deliberately lowered him into a crouch rather than sending him backward along the path he had come, was something quieter than courage. It was recognition. He had seen animals in difficulty before. He had seen his own cattle in distress during difficult births. He had seen the particular quality of suffering that moves across a living body when it is failing at something it cannot stop doing. He recognized what he was looking at. She was not resting. She was collapsed. He stayed crouched in the path for a long moment. He did not raise the lantern higher. He did not make a sound. He simply remained present at the edge of her space, letting her see him without the threat of forward movement, watching the rise and fall of her sides and trying to understand what he was seeing. Her body was exhausted in the way of a long-distance effort. She had traveled far, or labored long, or both. The ground beneath her was dry. She had not been here before the rains 3 nights ago, which meant she had come since then, had perhaps been lying here through the cold of last night, through the morning heat yesterday, through last night again. He stood, carefully. He did not look directly at her. As he rose, he had not planned this. But some knowledge in his body understood that direct eye contact at this moment was not what was needed. He kept his gaze slightly aside, and he began walking back toward the house, steadily, without running, the lantern swinging at his side. He went first to knock on the wall beside his wife's window and ask her to stay inside. Then he went to the road. It took him 20 minutes of walking before his mobile phone found enough signal. He had the number saved, not because he had ever needed it, but because 3 years earlier, a forest officer named Priya had come to the village and asked them to keep it, had stood in the square and explained, patiently and without condescension, that sometimes the forest and the farmland would share something that neither could handle alone. He dialed it now, standing on the dirt road in the cold dark, and waited. "It's a leopard," he said, when the line connected. "She's down in my field. I think she cannot get up." He paused. Somewhere behind him, far across the cane, came that low sound again, longer this time, more sustained, and threaded through with something that was not quite pain and not quite effort, but carried the weight of both. "She's going to have young," he said quietly. "Please come quickly." The road from the Forest Division office to the edge of Rajan's village took 40 minutes at that hour, and Priya drove it with the vehicle's headlights cutting through a darkness that was only just beginning to soften at its edges. Beside her sat Dr. Arvind, the team's wildlife veterinarian, his kit already organized in the back seat from the moment she had called him. Behind them, the second vehicle carried 2 field assistants, Suresh and a younger ranger named Meena, who had only been with the division 8 months, but who had already developed the particular quality of stillness that good fieldwork requires. Nobody spoke much on the drive. There was a kind of professional quiet that settles over a rescue team in transit, a collective gathering of attention before the work begins. Priya had taken down everything Rajan told her, and had spent the drive turning it over. A collapsed leopard at the field margin, heavily pregnant, down since at least the previous night, possibly longer. The variables were too many to calculate from a distance, and she had long since learned that arriving with assumptions was more dangerous than arriving with questions. What she knew was this: a leopard in late pregnancy who had left forest cover and come to open ground near a human settlement had done so because something had already gone wrong, or because something was about to. The vehicles stopped at the edge of the unpaved track where the cane fields began. They could not go further without noise and vibration that would have made everything harder. The team unloaded and practiced quiet equipment cases handled without the clatter of haste, doors closed with care. The sky to the east had gone from deep blue to a pale washed gray, and the tops of the sugarcane were turning faintly gold at their tips. Dawn was arriving, deliberate and indifferent, the way it always does. Rajan was waiting at the path entrance. He had been there the entire time, returning to the field after his call and settling himself at a distance from the animal that was close enough to discourage anyone else from approaching, but far enough to cause her no additional stress. He had sat on the ground in the old way, cross-legged, his shawl pulled around him, and he had stayed there in the cold for nearly an hour. When Priya reached him and looked at his face in the growing light, she understood that he had not moved because he was afraid, but because he had appointed himself to this task and had not seen fit to abandon it. He gave her the information the way farmers give information plainly, in order, without embellishment. The low sound he had heard, the location and position of the animal, how long he estimated she had been there. He mentioned, quietly, that he had heard the sound again twice while he waited, and that between those sounds, there had been periods of complete stillness that had concerned him. He said it without alarm. He said it the way a person says a thing they know must be passed to someone with more tools than they have. Priya thanked him, and then she did something that surprised him slightly. She asked him to stay near the path entrance while the team went forward. Not because his presence had been wrong, but because what came next would require the leopard to have as few unfamiliar stimuli as possible, and Rajan's presence had already been absorbed into her awareness over the past hours. Changing that equation now with additional figures required care. The team moved into the field path in a single slow line, Priya first, then Arvind, then Meena, with Suresh remaining back at the equipment. The lantern had been left with Rajan. They moved in the growing dawn light, which was enough now to see by, and they moved without torches, because the sudden introduction of directed light to a stressed wild animal is never without consequence. They smelled her before the path opened out, the same warm, wild musk that had stopped Rajan an hour earlier. Then they came around the last bend in the cane and stopped. She had shifted since Rajan had last seen her. She was no longer fully on her side, but had raised herself to a partial sternal position, her forelegs extended in front of her on the flattened grass, her enormous belly pressed against the earth. Her head was lowered, her chin nearly resting on her paws. Her breathing was visible from several meters away, the ribs rising and falling, with that same too deliberate quality that Rajan had described. When the team entered her line of sight, her ears moved, not pinned back in aggression, but rotating, locating, processing. Her eyes were more open than they had been. She was more alert than she had been an hour ago. Arvind crouched at Priya's shoulder and studied her without moving forward. He had been doing this long enough that his initial assessments were rarely wrong, and what he was reading in the positioning of her body, in the intermittent tension that moved through her haunches, in the way her breathing changed rhythm every several minutes, and then returned, he was reading labor, active labor. The cubs were already moving through the process that had likely been underway for most of the night, and the exhaustion in her posture was not the exhaustion of illness alone, but of prolonged, difficult, solo effort in inadequate shelter. "She's already in it," he said, barely above a whisper. The team understood immediately what this meant and what it did not mean. It did not mean they could intervene directly. A wild leopard in active labor, conscious and capable of response, could not be approached without sedation, and sedation during late-stage birth carried risks that would require careful weighing. What it meant was that they had arrived at a threshold. Behind them was the decision to act. Ahead of them was the necessity of watching, of assessing, of holding the particular professional tension of knowing when to hold back and when to move forward, a tension that never becomes comfortable no matter how many times a team has stood inside it. Meena had eased herself to the right of the path, creating a wider spread of the team's presence without advancing it, and was watching the leopard's flanks with the focused quiet of someone who has been trained to observe what others overlook. She noted the intervals between the animal's heaviest exertions. She noted that the leopard had not attempted to rise or retreat. She noted the quality of the ground beneath her dry, protected on two sides by the standing cane, with a natural hollow in the pressed grass that the animal had perhaps chosen specifically or had simply been too exhausted to leave. The light was fully breaking now. Gold was spreading from the hilltops down into the valley, and the sugarcane caught it and threw it back in long, slanted gleams. Rajan stood at the path entrance behind them, still and patient, his shawl around his shoulders, watching the eastern sky. The leopard lay in the growing warmth of the morning, her sides moving, her body doing what wild bodies do, continuing, even when everything is difficult, continuing. The team did not move forward. They held their position, and they watched, and they waited for the moment when the balance would tip and tell them what was needed. They had been holding their position for nearly 40 minutes when the quality of her stillness changed. It was not a dramatic shift. There was no sudden movement, no cry, no visible signal that a person untrained in observation would have caught. What changed was the texture of her breathing, something in its rhythm, compressing, the intervals between exhalations shortening, the tension that had been moving through her in slow waves, now arriving faster and staying longer. Arvind felt it before he could have explained it. He leaned slightly forward in his crouch without advancing his feet, and he watched her haunches, and he said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say that the team had not already understood. The morning had come fully by now. The gold that had begun at the hilltops had spread down through the valley and settled into the cane fields, turning everything warm and amber and very still. There was almost no wind. Birds had begun in the tree line behind the field margin, a pair of drongos, the distant percussion of a woodpecker, and their sounds made the space feel larger and calmer than it was for the humans crouching in it, holding the weight of what they could not control. She pushed. The effort moved through her entire body, visible along her spine, through the muscles of her hindquarters, and she made a sound with it, low and sustained and private, the kind of sound that belongs to the interior of a forest, not to the edge of a farm field at morning. She bore down against the grass, and the effort held for several long seconds and then released, and she dropped her chin back to her paws, and her sides heaved. Mina, watching from her position to the right, had begun timing silently. The second push came 9 minutes later. This one was harder. The leopard raised her head during it, her neck extended, her jaw slightly open, and the sound she made was deeper and carried a rawness that sat uncomfortably in the chest of everyone present. She held the effort longer than the first. Arvind had moved to a lower crouch, his weight on one knee, his eyes on the birth position, and then, in the way that arrival happens, which is always somehow both slower and faster than expected, the first cub came. It was small in the way that newborn leopard cubs are always astonishing to see, compact and dark, the spots barely suggested under the wet birth coat, the body curled in the involuntary posture of the newly arrived. It lay in the grass at the mother's haunches and did not move for a moment that lasted too long. Then it moved, a small contraction of the limbs, an uncoordinated shudder, and then a thin and wavering cry that seemed too large for the body it was coming from. The mother's head came up. She turned it slowly, with the deliberateness of exhaustion, and oriented toward the sound, with an attention so complete it seemed to reorganize her entire body. She had been a creature of effort and collapse for hours. What moved through her now was different. She pulled herself, with visible difficulty, closer to the cub, and she began to clean it with a focus that was absolute and methodical and utterly indifferent to the watching humans. Her tongue moved across the small body, clearing the birth membrane, stimulating circulation, doing the ancient biological work that no team of humans could have replaced. The cub's cries strengthened, its limbs moved with more intention. Its coat, as the mother worked over it, began to dry at the edges and lift into the first suggestion of its eventual pattern. Arvind did not speak. He looked at Priya, and she looked back, and between them passed the specific relief of people who have prepared for the worst and are watching something else unfold. 11 minutes after the first, the second cub came, and it did not cry. It arrived in the same way, the same wet and dark compactness, and it lay where it had come, and it was still, completely still, in a way that was different from the stillness of the first, not the stillness of gathering itself, but the stillness of absence. The team recognized it. Nobody moved, but the collective quality of their attention shifted into something sharper and more reluctant. The mother was still cleaning the first cub. Her back was partially toward the second. She had not yet oriented to it, and for a moment that stretched painfully, the second cub lay untended in the grass. Arvind's hand moved to his kit. He did not open it yet. He watched the second cub with the practiced measurement of a man calculating whether a body is absent or merely delayed, and across that calculation moved the awareness that if the mother did not engage with the second cub within the next short interval, the decision of whether and how to intervene would arrive whether they were ready for it or not. Then the second cub made a sound. It was not a cry. It was something smaller than a cry, a thin, broken exhalation that was barely audible across the distance, closer to a gasp than a call. But it was enough. The mother's ears rotated toward it with a precision that was immediate and total. Her head lifted from the first cub. She turned with that same slow and enormous effort, and she found the second cub with her nose before she found it with her eyes, dropping her great head to the grass and breathing across it, and then beginning to work. She cleaned the second cub with the same methodical intensity she had given the first, perhaps more, perhaps longer, her tongue moving across the still body again and again. Seconds passed, many seconds. Arvind's hand rested on his kit and did not move. And then, from within the grass and the mother's attending warmth, the second cub shuddered, a full-body contraction, and then another. And then, at last, the thin and wavering cry. Both cubs were crying now. The sounds braided together in the morning air, thin and persistent and alive. At the path entrance, Rajan had not moved from where Priya had asked him to stand. He had watched what he could see from that distance, not the details, but the shape of events, the quality of the team's posture, the sound that had just come from the grass. He was not a man given to public expression. He had been farming this land since before some of the team members had finished school. He stood in the morning light with his shawl around him and his old hands at his sides, and he did not notice, until he went to wipe his face against the cold, that his cheeks were wet. He left them there. He did not wipe them again. He simply stood and listened to the two small voices rising from his field and looked at the sky, which had gone entirely golden now, and said nothing, because nothing was needed. The cubs had been nursing for perhaps 10 minutes before the team allowed themselves to fully exhale. It had happened gradually, the way most survivals do, not in a single triumphant moment, but in a series of small confirmations, each one adding its weight to the side of continuation until the balance tipped and held. The second cub, the one that had arrived in silence, had found its way to the mother's flank with the blind and determined navigation of the newborn, driven by warmth and scent and nothing more complex than need. Its sibling had already been there. The mother had lowered her head to the grass and closed her eyes, and the slow, deliberate rise and fall of her breathing had taken on a different quality, still effortful, still carrying the residue of the night's long labor, but underneath the effort, something that was settling rather than straining. Arvind stayed in his crouch for another full minute after the nursing was confirmed, watching her color, watching the quality of her alertness, running the clinical inventory that his training required, even when what his eyes were seeing was already moving toward reassurance. Her mucous membranes, glimpsed during a moment when she had opened her mouth to attend to one of the cubs, were not the pale gray of serious cardiovascular compromise. Her breathing, while slow, was increasingly regular. She had been in a state of prolonged physiological stress that was beyond question, but the acute crisis, the knife edge of the early morning, appeared to have passed on its own terms. He moved back to Priya and kept his voice to a low murmur. The assessment was cautious but not pessimistic. They would monitor through the morning. They would not approach unless the mother's condition deteriorated or either cub showed distress. The situation had moved, for now, from emergency to vigil, and vigil required different things than emergency did: stillness, patience, the discipline of watching without acting, which is in some ways the harder of the two. The team reorganized itself quietly. Meena took the primary observation position, settled low in the path with a field notebook and a pair of compact binoculars. Suresh went back to the vehicles to retrieve water and the longer duration monitoring equipment. Priya walked back to the path entrance to speak with Rajan and to deal with what had developed while their attention had been entirely absorbed by the field. Word, in villages, moves the way water moves, finding every available channel and arriving at every low point before anyone has thought to redirect it. By the time Priya reached the path entrance, the tree line at the far edge of the unpaved road held perhaps 30 people. They had come quietly, which was itself a testament to something, to the fact that Rajan's truck was parked with the Forest Division vehicles, perhaps, or to the sight of the official uniforms, or simply to the instinctive understanding that certain things require a different kind of attention than ordinary events. They stood at the tree line in small groups, some with children held close, watching the field path entrance with a collective patience that was remarkable and would have surprised anyone who had not grown up understanding how deeply rural people can respect the weight of a wild moment. Rajan was still at the path entrance. He had not moved to join the gathered villagers, and they had not moved to join him. There was a boundary in operation that no one had announced, and no one had crossed an invisible perimeter defined entirely by his standing presence and the particular quality of his stillness. He was not performing authority. He simply had not left, and his not leaving had communicated everything necessary. Priya spoke to him briefly. She told him what she could, that both cubs were alive, that the mother was stabilizing, that the next hours would tell them more. She told him that his phone call had made a difference and that his staying had likely made a larger one. He received this without ceremony, nodding once, looking back toward the field path with the expression of a man filing information rather than collecting compliments. He asked only one question, whether she would be able to go back to the forest when it was over. Priya told him that was the intention, yes, that if the mother continued to stabilize and the cubs remained healthy, the goal was always to allow the family to move on in their own time without further human involvement. He nodded again. That seemed to be what he had needed to know. Out in the flattened grass, the leopard was moving through her first hour of motherhood with the slow and instinctive competence of a body doing what generations of bodies before it had done. She cleaned the cubs between nursing intervals, her tongue working over their small spotted heads and unsteady limbs with firm, repetitive care. The cubs responded to each pass of her tongue with involuntary movements, the limbs curling and extending, the heads turning, the tiny mouths opening in sounds that were barely audible from the team's distance but clearly present, clearly functional. She would pause between ministrations and lift her head, scanning the field with her ears and her nose before returning her attention downward. Her alertness was increasing with each passing interval. The eyes that had been half-lidded in exhaustion an hour ago were open now, and they moved across the field with more focus, more of the particular quality that makes a leopard's gaze feel architectural, precise, structural, measuring everything. She was reclaiming herself. It was not a dramatic process. It was the slow reoccupation of a self that had been temporarily surrendered to physical extremity, the return of awareness and agency and the instincts that govern a wild animal's relationship to its environment. She had been a creature of collapse in the small hours of the morning. She was becoming, by degrees, a mother in cover alert, present, and beginning to understand the situation she was in. Mina logged the intervals carefully. Nursing duration, head lifting frequency, ear and eye movement patterns, the quality of the cub's audible signals. She wrote steadily and without interruption, building the observational record that would eventually become part of the division's documentation of the event, would sit in a file somewhere and be read by people who had not been present, who would reconstruct from its careful notations the shape of what had happened in this field at this particular morning. At the tree line, the gathered villagers did not leave. They stood in the warming morning and watched the path entrance with a patience that had settled into something resembling a collective vigil of their own. Some had brought water. Some of the older women had sat down at the base of trees. The children who had been held close at first were now simply standing, watching, in the way that children watch things they do not yet have words for but understand to be important. Rajan had returned to his position at the path entrance. He stood with his shawl loose around his shoulders now, the morning having warmed enough to make it unnecessary, and he looked into the cane field where none of them could see what the team could see, and he waited with the same uncomplicated steadiness with which he had been doing everything since that morning's small hours. There was nothing asked of him now except to remain, and remaining was something he knew how to do. The cubs' thin voices rose and fell in the grass, small and persistent, threading through the warm morning air like a sound that had always been there and was only now being heard. By midday, the team had settled into the long and unglamorous patience that wildlife monitoring requires: rotating observation shifts, quiet note-taking, the careful documentation of intervals and behaviors that would later compose an official record of the morning's events. The leopard had slept for nearly 2 hours in the late morning warmth, the cubs tucked close against her belly, rising and falling with her breathing like small boats on a slow tide. Arvind had completed 3 remote assessments from the observation position, and each one had moved the dial further toward cautious confidence. Her color was good, her responsiveness to environmental sounds was appropriate and increasingly sharp. The prolonged exhaustion of the night was lifting visibly, the way weather lifts not in a moment but across time, the heaviness thinning and the clarity returning by degrees. The villagers at the tree line had thinned through the middle hours. Some had returned home for the necessities of afternoon animals to tend, meals to prepare, the ordinary obligations that do not pause for extraordinary mornings. But a core group had remained, seated in the shade of the trees in a loose and patient arrangement, and Rajan had remained with them, having finally crossed the few meters from the path entrance to lean against the trunk of an old neem at the road's edge. He had eaten something that one of the women from the village had brought, a roti folded around something he did not particularly taste, and he had drunk water, and he had stayed. The afternoon came in over the hills with the particular quality of October light in that region, long and level and golden, softer than the direct heat of midday, casting everything in a warmth that made even the dry margins of the field look considered, intentional. The sugarcane threw its shadows long across the path. The birds in the tree line behind the field had resumed their ordinary business, and their sounds had settled back into the background texture of the place, no longer marking the strangeness of the morning, but simply accompanying the afternoon as they accompanied all afternoons. It was Mina who saw her rise. She had been watching through the binoculars during her observation shift, logging a quiet interval when the leopard's posture changed. Not the small adjustments of a sleeping animal resettling, but a fundamental reorganization of the body, the forelegs extending, the haunches gathering, the slow and deliberate process of a large animal returning to its full height after long time on the ground. She rose with visible effort, her legs holding a slight tremor in the first seconds that steadied as she stood and collected herself. She stood fully for the first time since anyone present had known her, and the size of her was striking in a way that lying down had not prepared them for the depth of her chest, the length of her, the quality of presence that belongs to a large predator fully vertical. The cubs had been disturbed by her rising and were moving in the grass at her feet, making small sounds of displacement and confusion, their unsteady legs carrying them in the tentative, over-correcting movements of animals only hours old. She lowered her head to them, nose touching each one, a brief and efficient reassurance, and then she stood again and looked toward the tree line. Priya understood immediately. She turned and caught Arvind's eye, and he was already nodding. This was not a moment for intervention. This was the moment they had hoped for, and had not allowed themselves to count on the moment of her own decision, her own assessment of what was needed, her own navigation of the path forward. A wild animal choosing to move is the only outcome that matters in work like this, the only ending that carries no asterisk. The team held absolutely still. She took the first cub in her jaws with a gentleness that was precise and total, the loose scruff grip that leopard mothers use, which looks severe to human eyes and is in practice the safest available transport, the cub's body going limp with an involuntary reflex as old as the species. She moved with it toward the tree line at the field's far edge, not at speed but with a steadiness that carried intention in every step. She had chosen a direction. She knew where she was going, or her body knew, which amounts to the same thing in a wild animal navigating toward cover. She carried the first cub perhaps 30 meters into the longer grass at the field margin and set it down, and she turned back. The second cub was still in the flattened birth grass, moving in its small, wobbling way, vocalizing in the thin, persistent register of newborn need. The mother crossed back to it, and the team watched her complete the calculation that wild mothers complete, assessing, orienting, taking the second cub in her jaws with the same careful grip. But before she lifted it fully, she paused. She stood over it for a moment with her head lowered, breathing across it, and the stillness she held in that pause carried something in it that no one in the observation position attempted to name or explain in their field notes, because field notes have a specific language, and that moment existed outside it. Then she lifted the second cub and walked toward the tree line, and she did not look back. At the road's edge, Rajan had stood when he saw the movement begin. He was too far to see the details. The cubs were hidden in the grass, and the team was between him and the field, but he could see the shape of her, upright and moving, the amber and black of her coat, catching the late afternoon light as she crossed the field margin and entered the longer grass. He could see her stop and return and cross again. He understood what he was watching even from that distance. He stood against the neem tree with his hands at his sides, and he watched until the tree line at the far edge of the field received her, until the forest, which had lent her to the morning, took her back. She disappeared between the trunks without hesitation, without a backward orientation, carrying the second cub into the green and layered dark. In the flattened birthgrass, where she had spent the night and the morning, there was nothing left but the pressed shape of her in the earth, a body-length impression in the dry stems, already beginning to slowly lift and lose its definition in the afternoon air. Priya released a long breath. Around her, the team came quietly out of their vigil postures, shoulders dropping, the collective held tension of hours finally setting down its weight. Rajan stayed at the neem tree for a while longer. The rest of the village that had remained began drifting back along the road, speaking in low voices, and the ordinary sounds of the afternoon reasserted themselves around him, a bicycle bell somewhere, the distant complaint of a cow, the wind moving through the sugarcane in its old and patient way. He looked at the tree line where she had gone, which was now simply a tree line again, unchanged, holding its green silence. The light was going amber and long across the fields, and somewhere inside those trees, in whatever hollow or rocky shelter she was already navigating toward, two spotted cubs were being carried into the life that had almost not begun. He picked up his shawl from the neem's root where he had set it hours ago, and he walked home along the field path, and the sugarcane closed behind him, and the evening came on, and the forest kept what it had taken back.